3.
From the McNeil Studios in beautiful Baja, Tustin, here is Professor McNeil.
Thank you. We're going to talk about economic growth. Economic growth is an increase in the capacity of the economy to produce, the productive capacity of the economy to produce, and we can show it as an outward shift in the production possibilities frontier, or we can show it as a rightward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. Both of these are illustrations of economic growth. What causes economic growth is an increase in resources or technology, normally. So, or the economic system that we're using. So, in order to illustrate this, we're going to show you the production function. The production function is the relationship between outputs and inputs given fixed factors. So, our inputs are labor, and our outputs are production, and we're assuming that we have a certain amount of capital, a certain amount of technology, and a certain amount of natural resources in the economy. So the capital, technology, and resources are fixed in the economy. We have a certain capital stock and technology level and so forth. And then the question is, the production function asks, what happens when we start adding variable units of labor, that is more and more labor, to the existing stock of capital and technology? And what we end up with is the production function. Now, the production function has this shape, that is, it increases throughout, but then it has this sort of laying over shape, and if you push it far enough, it'll get negative. And that's because of the law of diminishing returns. The law of diminishing returns is a short-run concept because you have a fixed factor and you have variable factors. The fixed factors are capital, technology, and natural resources, and the variable resources are labor resources. So this has to do with factor proportions, and that factors want to be combined in fairly fixed proportions or in certain proportions. So that if you have very few units of labor and lots of capital, you'll get this much output. If you add more labor to it, you get increasing amounts of output. So that what's happening is the slope is getting steeper and steeper. What that means is that the marginal product of each additional worker is getting larger for a bit. This is not certain, but the law of diminishing returns says that at some point, as you add more and more workers, the added output from each additional worker gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And at some point may be zero. The marginal product here, this last million workers hired in, is zero. There was nothing additional produced from this. And if you carry it further, it may be that your marginal product turns negative. That is, you have over here with the negative part of marginal of the production function, you have negative returns, and that's because the proportions, you have too much labor for the amount of capital and technology. Here, down in this range of increasing returns, you are starting to get the proportions better because you're starting to add enough workers to, enough labor to this existing capital stock and technology and natural resources. Then, as you go outward further and further, the proportions change kind of unfavorably so that you start flooding the existing capital and technology with workers, and the increment of output, that is the marginal product, how much additional output gets produced by an additional worker, gets smaller and smaller and eventually zero. So this is the law of diminishing returns, and it's what explains the shape of the production function, that the marginal product at some point decreases. So what happens if we, how do we know what the actual level of output is, real GDP in this case? And the answer is it depends on how much labor you put in. Well, how much labor do you put into an economy? And the answer is, you're told this from the labor markets. If this is the supply of labor in the economy, and that's the demand for labor in the economy, then this is the equilibrium quantity of labor, and that's the equilibrium real wage in the economy. So if the natural level of employment in the economy is 50 million workers, we plug 50 million workers into this graph, and it tells us that our real GDP will be 7 trillion or so. Now, what would cause a movement from here, point A, to point B? And the answer is a change in the dependent variable. So if, for instance, there was an increase in the supply of labor and the quantity of workers, the natural level of employment in the economy increased to 60 million workers, that would cause this change, this increase in output from 7 to 7.5 or so, whatever this increase is. So we would get a movement along the production function if the quantity of labor changed. What would cause a shift in the production function? And the answer, of course, is... okay, put the phone away. The answer, of course, is a change in any of the constants. So if we got more capital, better technology, or more natural resources, that means that at every quantity of labor with more capital or better technology, that same quantity, 30 million in this case, could produce more units. 40 could produce more output. 50 could produce more output. 60 could produce more output. And as a result, we get an upward shift of the production function. And not only that, it gets steeper. And what that means is that the marginal product of labor gets greater. Each additional worker contributes larger additional amounts of output to the production process. So, long-run aggregate supply and economic growth is the topic here. So I give you the labor markets, the production function, PF here for production function, and then aggregate supply, aggregate demand that determines real GDP and the price level in the economy. And the way it works is this. If we take the natural level of output, say this is 50 million workers, as in the last example, and here's 30, 40, 50 million workers, bumpity, bumpity, bump. We plug 50 million in, and this tells us that the real GDP will be $7 trillion worth of output, whatever this quantity is. 7. Well, natural level of output produces $7 trillion. That means our potential level of output is 7 trillion. So our long-run aggregate supply is $7 trillion. It's vertical because it doesn't depend on the price level at that point. So that's how we determine this. Now, what would happen if, again, if there's a change in the value of the independent variable, which is the quantity of labor? Well, we would plug the quantity of labor, 60 million workers, into this, and now with 60 million workers but the same production function, we get $7.5 trillion worth of output, and our long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right to 7.5. What if, however, we have the same 50 million workers working? There's the supply of labor, the demand for labor, and this is the production function. And here's 50 million, the same 50 million is over there, and this produces $7 trillion worth of output. So I've set it up just like this one. And the long-run aggregate supply, our potential level of output, is 7 trillion. Instead of having a change in the quantity of labor, what would happen if we got more capital, more natural resources? My preference would, of course, be to Steel Canada or Baja California. That would be an increase in natural resources. Or, if we get better technology, well, that would shift the production function upward, because no matter what the quantity of labor, they can now produce more because they have better technology or more capital or more resources. And the slope of this production function gets steeper as well, which means the marginal product of labor is greater because they have more capital and technology to work with. Well, that 50 million workers now, there's no change in the quantity of labor. We're still at the natural level of employment here. But this will produce now $8 trillion worth of goods and services, and our long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. And our short-run aggregate supply curve piggybacks on that. So now we have what happens If there's a change in the value of the dependent variable, we get this movement, but it still causes economic growth, that is the rightward shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. What if something besides the independent variable, one of the constants changes, production function shifts, in this case upward, and long-run aggregate supply shifts to the right? That's economic growth also. But there's one very important point here, and that is this demand for labor curve is based on the productivity of labor. It's kind of a micro topic, but when the productivity of workers, of labor, increases, then the demand for workers will increase, and there will be more hired, and the real wage will go up a little bit as well. So that when technology or capital increases, that tends to put upward pressure on the wages. And both wages and living standards increase as a result of this increase in productivity. So what we've done is we've connected the labor markets, the production function, and the long-run aggregate supply, and we've explained how an economy grows. I think we've done a pretty good job.